Welcome back, everyone. So in the last video, we generated our store, and we're also now passing it into this provider that we use to wrap our application. This provider, of course, we get from React Redux, which behaves just like the providers that we have used so far. Speaking of providers, what we need to do is we need to now figure out how to replace our user provider utilizing the reducer that now lives inside of our root reducer in Redux. So it's going to be very similar. We know that there's a dispatch, and we know that we need to get the current user object. It's just that now, instead of coming from use reducer, it comes from two different hooks inside of React Redux. First and foremost, we are no longer using a user provider, which means we need to get this value somehow from our actual application in another way. The main thing is that currently inside of our user provider, we actually fire off this use effect, which subscribes to our on-auth state change listener. Depending on this is how we actually update using effects to get this actual value we need. So how do we do this? Well, we actually want to move this into our app.js, because prior, when you think about the index.js, the first thing that mounts is actually the user provider. So the moment the user provider mounts, it fires off the effect. We no longer are relying on this provider anymore. In fact, we might as well just remove it so that we can be very clear that this is no longer something that we're using. What we're going to do is we are instead going to rely on the part of our application that mounts first, that cares about the user. In fact, the entire application, we need to make sure that we have our user. It's a very top level thing that matters. So what we're going to do is we're going to paste in that use effect code that we had from our user context. We also need to make sure we bring in all these dependencies that we need. So we know that we need use effect. We also know that we need all of these different libraries. So actually, let me just copy this over, because chances are we're going to need a lot of it. So I'm just going to copy this over. I'm going to move this down to where we have our own internal imports. And then I just want to make sure whether or not these are actually pointing to the correct thing. So here I believe that we need to reduce this relative route, because essentially we're at the root folder and now we're pointing to the correct files. So we need access also to this set current user value that we had before inside of our user context. This is the last thing that seemingly has not been imported. So let me also get rid of this use reducer and this create context. So what is set current user? Inside of user context, set current user is this action creator function that we made that dispatches an action inside of our provider. So now we still want this action creator, but because this is getting called in app.js, we don't want to localize this selector inside of app.js. Instead, we want it to be potentially available to anyone that wants to set current user. Even though we only use it inside of app.js, that doesn't mean that will always be the case. So this is where we're going to make a new file inside of our store user folder called user.action.js. And what this action is going to be is pretty much the exact same thing as this action creator right here. So let's actually copy this over like so. It's set current user is a function. It receives the user, and what it will do is instead of dispatching here, it's just going to create and return us back the action object. So the action object is generated using our create action helper function. So let's first import that in. The other thing is we need our user action types. So this user action types is living currently in our user reducer. So what I like to do is move this up into its own file again called user.types.js. And here, this will be an export. By doing this now, it's at the root folder level of this user, because inside is where it's primarily getting called. So I want this to be shared between all of the files in this folder. And it's very clear what lives inside this, which is everything related to our types. Because sometimes as you add more actions and you add more code to your reducer, this grows to a point where it becomes really hard to read. So we might as well do a lot of this separation. These are just scalable techniques that we've learned throughout the years of building scalable React applications using Redux. So this is it. We also need to export out this action creator, and now set current user is pretty much the exact same as you see. It's just now reduxified. So it's just a function that retrieves a user object, and then what it will do is it will create and return back a object where the type is this user action string, and then the value is the user for payload. So now that we have this, let's go back to our app.js so that we can bring this in for set current user call. So here, I also want to get rid of this create action because the action is getting generated inside of our action creator now. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import in this set current user from our store folder, our user folder, and then our user action creator. Now, here's another thing. As we know, our user set current user is no longer dispatching. This is now just creating an object for us, which is our action object. We actually still need to dispatch this. In order to do that, we need to bring in dispatch from useDispatch hook. Now, this useDispatch hook is what we get back from React Redux. As I mentioned, React Redux is the library that gives us React bindings, which are hooks really, that allow us to interact with the Redux store. So we can say, hey, const dispatch is going to be the method we get back from the useDispatch hook. And this dispatch works exactly the same way as our user context dispatch. But as I mentioned, this dispatch dispatches actions to the root reducer, which in turn passes the action to every single reducer function. So here there's only one dispatch from React Redux. There's only ever one instance of it. In fact, if you hover over this warning here, you'll see that there's a missing dependency for dispatch. The thing is that dispatch here, coming from useDispatch, never updates. It's always going to be the same reference. So here, really, dispatch will never change. You don't have to pass it if you don't want to, but if you want the lint error to go away, you can pass it as well. The reason why this complains is because React does not know that this dependency that it's getting from a hook, this dispatch, doesn't change. We know this because we know that the way that React Redux works is that it only generates one dispatch for us and it will never change that reference. But because the hook doesn't know, it's going to complain and send you a warning because we are using this dispatch inside. This is just one of those things. It varies honestly from team to team whether or not they add or not, because this kind of is misguided in some way. This implies that this effect will rerun every single time that this dispatch changes. But in reality, this dispatch is not going to change. You can see where this confusion might lie. So it's really up to you. Personally, I like to get rid of it because I know for sure anyways, this effect is only running on initialization in order to set up this listener anyways. So we can just set it up like this. Some of these warnings, you really do need to use your own judgment. Unfortunately, the linting is a little aggressive and this is a very contentious topic, but that's another conversation. For now, what we have is set up our code. So let's go back to our application and see what happens. Here we see these new logs. These logs are what I was talking about. Essentially, this is what tells us the previous state and the current state. So let me just refresh so we can see it live. So we see one action fire. This action fires when our code initializes, and then we see that this is our initial state. Current user equals null. We remember this inside of our new user reducer where state is the default state, the initial state. Then what happens is that because our auth listener, we're already signed in for our application. Our auth listener is aware, oh, let me get that user. And then what happens is our code triggers. So it fires that new action that we dispatched, the set current user. And what happens here, you'll see that there's the type set current user, but there's also this payload. So here, all of this is working. And then in the next state, of course, our user reducer is going to respond and it's going to update current user with that new user object that we got as the payload. So this is really handy because every time an action fires, you see what was the previous state, what's the next state. of the entire Redux state. Right now, we only have one reducer, so you only see the one value. But as this scales, you will see all of your state. So again, you have one centralized state rather than multiple contexts that have different reducers. Here, it's all in one location now. And this is the Redux flow. So now that we understand how to create and dispatch actions, in the next video, what we are going to do is learn how to actually pull these values off of state and then use them in our application. I'll see you in the next video.